welcome everyone. Um, Welcome. Thank you for coming to Writing the Body, which is part of BLR's Conversations on Creative Writing and Healthcare series. I'm Danielle Ofri, Editor-in-Chief of Bellevue Literary Review. If you don't know BLR, we are a literary magazine, actual magazine, but also digital copies as well. And we publish fiction, poetry, and nonfiction about health, illness, and healing. And this year is our 25th anniversary. And so this is one of our kickoff events. We're so glad you're here. Many of you were at our conversation back in the fall when we hosted several doctor and nurse writers, and we had a wonderful turnout and great feedback. But there was one comment that many people said is, where are the patient voices? Well, here we are tonight. We are welcoming three extraordinary writers who write about their own illness experience from the patient perspective. And their books confront illness not as an abstraction, but as something lived, something felt in the body, negotiated in language, and somehow, beyond all odds, shaped into story. And their books explore what happens when the standard medical framework somehow falls short, and how writing can put something in that place. Their books are for sale on the BLR Bookshop page, and I encourage you to buy them. So I'm very delighted to welcome tonight's panelists. We have Meghan O'Rourke, the author of The Invisible Kingdom, Rebekah Taussig, author of Sitting Pretty, and Porochista Khakpour, the author of Sick. So thank you all for being here. Before we start, I will say that Meghan is at the tail end of the flu and has really been a trooper to come join us tonight. But BLR is giving her an official doctor's note and that she might jump off a little early to go have a cup of tea and rest up. So thank you all. All of these books, they emerge from these deeply lived experiences of illness. And there's lots we can talk about illness, the medical system, the chaos of being a patient. But tonight we're especially interested in the act of writing and how these experiences are translated and shaped, and I think understood through narrative. So let's start here. I'm going to ask each of you, when you first began writing about illness, what felt hardest to put into words, and conversely, like what surprised you about trying to translate bodily experience into language, especially when your illness may itself have resisted sort of a clear conventional story. And so, Meghan, maybe I'll start with you while you're on your top of your energy level for the evening.
Totally. Thank you. And I'm sorry, in addition to having the flu, my children, who I told I was going to be on a Zoom, have started bouncing a basketball inside the house right in this room. So I apologize I'm contending with many forces tonight. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I'm not at my best or most fluent, but I'm really grateful to Danielle and to BLR for including me in this conversation. I think about this all the time. So in a sense, my entire book is about the challenge of writing the book, right? My book is called The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness. A lot of the book is about not only the story of my own illness, which was a kind of, for years, ambiguous set of symptoms that came and went and took many years to get a diagnosis. I ultimately was diagnosed with autoimmune disease, a tick-borne illness, and POTS, which some of you may know. But in that time period, I was struck by, as a writer, how hard it was to tell the story of my illness, not only to myself, to my friends and family, but especially to doctors, right? And so one of the things that I think is so interesting about illness is it's something that we all experience in some form or another, and yet it can be very hard to create a bridge from the well to the sick, or the sick to the well. There's a way in which, when the body starts to sort of misfunction or malfunction, that experience, if it's not something you've already had, can be very hard to imagine or picture. I think because we're very rooted in the belief that our bodies are kind of they're the vessels for our being. It seems hard to imagine them falling apart until they start to fall apart, right? So I was really interested in my book in what was, early on, I realized in order to write it, I was going to have to think about a genre beyond the genre of an illness narrative. And so the genre I thought about was the detective story. And I thought, if I can get readers interested in this as a kind of detective story, like, here's a problem, there's something wrong, it's a mystery, what is the answer to that mystery? There would be more points of entrance to to the kind of challenge of deciding whether to believe, whether I was a good observer of my own, experience. And the last thing I'll say there, and this is something I talk about a lot in the book, is that one of the very strange things about writing about illness right now is that the way that modern medicine is set up, that the patient is not the most important, doesn't have the most important evidence, right? And so it puts a special kind of narrative challenge to the writer, right? Where the writer is used to being the kind of authority figure, but in a way, as soon as you begin to write about your own illness, you become unreliable. So how did you negotiate that? Was something I thought about a lot.
Which I find so fascinating as a physician. I really, it makes me think a lot about that, and we can talk about like the unreliable narrator a bit. But Rebekah, I'm gonna toss this one over to you. And what was your experience of writing about illness?
Yeah. Oh, well, also I just want to second, I'm so happy to be here in this conversation and among these voices. So and for all the people showing up, like this feels like a really important and in some ways urgent conversation to me. So thank you for everyone that's gathering around it. It's interesting, Megan, our experiences of our bodies are really different in a lot of ways, right? Like, I was absolutely fascinated by your experience in reading your book about all of the invisibility around your or kind of erasure of your experience because it wasn't visible. And my body displays its illness quite visibly in that you can't see it in the Zoom screen, but I'm paralyzed and I've moved through the world in a wheelchair since I was really young. But I think the overlap that I feel in what you described is the difficulty in claiming my own authority over my story of my body, which overlaps in interesting ways. But I think for me, part of it is this, the important piece of this is that my body was sort of pulled into the experience of being a patient really early and really young. Hello, we have another person that joined us. Hi. I was just after my first birthday when I was diagnosed with cancer, and so I was sort of learning scripts about my body and hearing scripts about my body, hearing my body narrated by these authoritative voices as I was learning language. And so I think that for me, the challenge of writing about my body in some ways is just a very human challenge of even noticing that I have a body and that I have the authority to speak about it or name it or even, I don't know, it's almost like feeling it first before I even would reach for words. I think I learned to detach from my body really early. And I think part of that was survival techniques. I think part of that was hearing it, like watching it sort of become an object or a symbol in some of these spaces, a symbol of, a child who has cancer, a child moving through the world in a wheelchair is immediately pulled into all of these other stories in medical spaces, but also like in our faith community. And so I think for me, the challenge of narrating the experience of my body really comes back to trying to tune out a lot of the other narratives and realize that I have access to something right here that I really learned to tune out. So it's interesting. I think Sitting Pretty, Danielle, you mentioned my book, Sitting Pretty. I think Sitting Pretty is the beginning of that in some ways. It's the beginning of sort of claiming this narrative and writing about something for myself, an experience that feels true to me. But in some ways, when I read back and I look at some of those pages, I think like, where is my body here? Like I write about the idea of my body and I have the way that my body interacts with a lot of ideas. But I think that the process of learning to return to my body and pay attention to what its experience is in the world is it's going to be a long arc for me. It's a skill that I'm still really trying to sort out. So anyways, that's the beginning of some of that.
Well, thank you. That's a really interesting point. I think we'll get back to the idea. I think for people who have, as adults, gone from the sort of kingdom of the well to the kingdom of the sick, have that bridge, as Megan said, and that bridge also refers to language, the language of ordinary humans and the language of illness. When you've grown up there, that you're a native, you're a digital native to that language, and that's really, and you know, reclaiming sort of non-medical language is a really interesting thing. Um, Porchisa, I'm going to turn it over to you. What surprised you about putting your body and your illness into words, if anything?
Well, a lot actually, because I really have always, also thank you so much for having me here too. I'm very delighted to be here and it's an honor. It's a very crazy time, so I know it's hard for everybody to be here. So, half of my brain is with Iran right now, so it's very hard to, I'm Iranian if people don't know, so it's been very stressful. But for me, basically, I never really knew much about memoirs, and I never had thought of myself as a writer of creative nonfiction. I'm primarily a fiction writer and a journalist, and those were always my two modes. I've been writing articles since the late 90s, and I continue. But really, my stuff was always out there, but didn't have a huge audience. And then years and years ago, I had a really great editor who I became friends with, Cal Morgan, who used to work at Riverhead. Before that, HarperCollins. That was where he became my acquiring editor ultimately. And we had been at some event in New York, and I'd said to him how reluctant I was about memoirs. This is back in like 2014 or something like that. But I felt like people wanted it from me because I would make these really long Facebook posts, and then later it became Instagram posts and Twitter. I was always sharing stuff about my illness, but sometimes it was just in a pragmatic way because I didn't know how to get help. In fact, Meghan is someone who at one point reached out to me because I was making these very sad, desperate posts, and she was really helpful and like referring me to a doctor that actually ended up saving my life. So it's like I was just doing that because I couldn't find my illness communities. And unfortunately, like I don't want to say this as a blanket statement about like Iranian culture, but I come from a pretty ableist universe. Like my Iranian culture was pretty ableist. And my parents were always telling me, you're fine, don't talk about this, don't talk about this. And I was already writing some essays for the New York Times around 2008 about family stuff, really hoping that those essays were going to help people read my fiction. I was always reluctant about this stuff because there is some taboos, cultural taboos about talking about your family in my world. So I just wasn't feeling okay. And then Cal and I, when we talked about this book, Sick, being possibly a memoir that I could write, at first I was thinking, I just want to do a chapbook that we could like hand out in hospitals. You know, I come from a world that loves like DIY projects and stuff. And I was like, I'll just do this thing so like we can just help people and give it to different groups and things like that. And he was just like, you need money. You're bad at money. Like, I was like, you're right. I am bad at money. That is true. And that's never changed. But anyways, that became a subject even in it. You know, we talk about class, we talk about a traumatic brain injury I had, we talk about addiction in the book. I even say we because I feel like the editors were like so instrumental in helping me piece that book. But also the summer before, like we sold it on proposal, but the summer when I was really supposed to get to it, I read every memoir I could get my hands on. Everything from like Cheryl Strayed's Wild to Roxane Gay's Hunger. I was like mesmerized by the world of Susanna Catalan's Brain on Fire. Like I just started reading everything I could, and then going back, like I was friends with Sarah Manguso, but I hadn't read her illness memoir. You know, I started just reading everything I could get my hands on. I was like, this is an incredible genre. Like this could really save people's lives. Like I see why people need these books. And so then I was like, okay, full force, let's do it. And then that was a whole crazy thing because then I had a traumatic brain injury in the middle of composing this book. That's why it's in the book, because I couldn't turn it in on the deadline. And HarperCollins was like, you have to. And so that I actually, the exercise of writing the book is what helped me out of the traumatic brain injury. Actually, I had to disobey all my doctor's rules about not looking at screens. And then they saw me as a guinea pig because I was actually getting better faster by forcing myself to write. Because, you know, when you get traumatic brain injuries, they give you neuropsychiatric tests, vestibular tests, all sorts of tests. And I ended up recovering a little faster than most people. But then I got sick on the book tour. You know, there's been nonstop disasters. So I keep sharing with my communities, and I really see something good in that. But it took a while for people to even tell me, like, there's some press that I never read on the sick book tour until like literally last year. So it was a really weird experience for me living it while it was coming out. At one point, I had to do an interview like literally on a stretcher. which was nuts. I didn't want to do it. I thought it was like going to be recorded for another time. And they were like, oh no, you're live. And it was like a nightmare. So it
Wow.
was,
So that's very, I think we'll get back to that more about the experience
yeah,
of
yeah.
writing, while you're sick. That's a whole other thing, or while recovering. And you mentioned Susanna Cahalan's book. She'll be actually part of our next conversations on mapping the mind. So stay tuned. Um, Continue along the idea of how we write about this. One of the challenges I think for any writer, but particularly those writing about their own illness, is how do you translate physical sensations, pain, fatigue, um, and even or emotional things like uncertainty into language without flattening them? And I'm going to ask you that, and also ask, were there any experiences of the body that actually resisted narration altogether? And Megan, I'll pass it off to you first.
Okay. I just want to echo quickly that Porochista also helped me. She gave me great advice for when I started my Lyme disease treatment, like what I could expect. It was a very scary time, and you really gave me some crucial advice. So thank you. And I do think that I also was writing The Invisible Kingdom while I was sick. In fact, I started the book thinking it was primarily about autoimmune disease and ended up realizing it was also a book about kind of so-called contested illnesses like ME/CFS and Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses, and eventually long COVID, because I got diagnosed with these things as as I was writing. Virginia Woolf famously said in her wonderful book on being ill, I think it's called On Being Ill. If you haven't read it, you should go read it. She famously said, if you fall in love, the merest schoolgirl has at her fingertips Keats and Shakespeare to describe the feeling of love, right? But get sick or find yourself in pain and language runs dry. There's actually not that. She was writing, of course, about 100 years ago, and she said, there's just not that much writing about illness. Well, that is starting to change. But I think one of the things that's hard is, in a way, when there's not already a legacy of writing about it, what you're writing into is the cultural space of receptivity for your writing. So it's not just the challenge that you have of articulating something, it's the challenge you have in knowing how the listener will receive it, right? And I mention this because one thing I often say to my students is, my writing students, I say, imagine that you're 14, 15 years old and you fall in love, you get a crush, but you've never read about it anywhere in literature. You've never seen a movie about it. You've never heard a pop song about it. You would be like, what is happening to me? This is so weird. I must be so strange. I must be different from everybody. I mean, is this feeling is this normal? Is this not? And in a way, that was the experience that I had of getting sick because I was having these sensations, but I was coming up against a medical system that was telling me there's nothing wrong with you. Don't worry. You're probably just working too hard. You're probably just a little bit anxious, right? So the challenge that I had was not simply the challenge of like, how do I describe this kind of pain or that kind of sensation? It was that I was having a kind of constellation of symptoms that the medical system regards as subjective, like fatigue, it's not the right word for it, pain, but we just didn't have any kind of received framework. So I had to, in a sense, invent one. And in a way, you find yourself having to really slow down. I was a poet before I was a memoirist and a journalist like Porochista. So I bring a lot of reporting into my work. And what I realized is I had to like slow down and almost report on what I was experiencing. So I couldn't just say I was experiencing fatigue. I had to say, this wasn't fatigue. It was a kind of cellular tiredness, as if, and then I had to think as a poet of a metaphor that would, animate that. I remember thinking for weeks, like, how do I explain this thing that's it's not fatigue. Sleeping doesn't make it go away. And I remember seeing some terrible Marvel, maybe it was like Spider-Man movie where the character gets kind of disintegrated in like a, nuclear accelerator or something. And then he like has to, and I was like, oh, it's like that. It's like you're holding your body together. It's made of sand, right? And you have to hold. So I do think as a writer, there was like whole stretches of writing The Invisible Kingdom that were not focused on structure or characterization but were really focused on thinking about like, where do I have to slow down and almost animate this as if no one has ever experienced it and I have to name it for the first time? Because even though we have words for it, those words are so general, right? That you have to kind of cut past the assumptions that exist about someone saying, I felt fatigue. Well, all sorts of questions arrive. Is this person depressed? Are they, are they, do they have some other psychological problem, right? So figuring out like how to both account for what I was trying to say and how it would be received, and kind of my understanding of how it was going to be received, was this very complicated iterative process, if that makes any sense at all. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually it's very interesting, as a physician, I look at it from the other way. Someone comes and says, I feel tired, right?
Yeah.
And you're right, that could be 1,001 things, from not getting enough sleep,
Right.
scrolling Instagram all day, or having a deadly cancer, or having domestic violence, or being hungry,
Right.
or having diabetes. Could be anything.
Right.
And
Right.
that's the job, to take this huge haystack of
Yes.
fatigue,
Yes.
and and the truth is, most people with fatigue in that haystack probably aren't getting enough sleep.
Right.
But there are a few strands in there who are going to have something terrible, and that's
Yeah.
also the sort of panic of us, is you don't want to miss those one or two, but you
Yeah.
also don't want to take the whole haystack and send them all to an MRI machine, or $1 million workup, because that doesn't work either. So we also struggle with language, that we really have a poorly. I think about those old hotels with all the little boxes for the keys. We've
Yeah.
all these boxes in medicine,
Yeah.
but they're not that good. They're
Right.
good if you hit right in the box. Perfect. Oh my
Right.
gosh, you have hyperparathyroidism. Beautiful.
Right.
But anyone
Right.
who doesn't fit in that box, it's really hard, because our language isn't
Yeah.
very well.
Yeah.
Porchista, I want to pass it to you. In terms of writing about bodily sensations, particularly ones that feel very general or vague, how did you do that?
It was pretty challenging because like Megan said, like we have these invisible illnesses like Lyme disease, and then I found out I had all these other things. Once you go into the Lyme world, you discover you have 10 million other things, and some of them are so individual. Like I would sometimes write to people like, did you get electric shocks down your spine at times? Did you get these weird pressure headaches that make you feel like your brain's gonna explode? Like they were all so weird, and some doctors just look at you like, what are you talking about? And then some of your friends are like, you're going crazy. And then to talk about like actual mental health symptoms too, which I was also dealing with, because I mean, I've had pretty bad PTSD since I was a child. I mean, I was a refugee of the Iran-Iraq War, so that was kind of expected, I guess. I've had OCD as a young child, and we didn't really go to psychiatrists or take medications at that point. My family, they were barely surviving. I don't remember my parents ever having health insurance. So like it was trying to describe all that stuff was quite challenging, because I was also a little bit worried. So there was a book that I still recommend all the time, although it's really harrowing. So sometimes people have to know it's going to be triggering. William Styron's Darkness Visible was a
Okay.
real revelation for me, that book, because it's a very slender memoir, and it's just relentless in how it approaches like a person's like psychological deterioration. And I loved it. I just thought it was the bravest book I've ever read, because it also is very critical of certain medications, which were very taboo already in my world. We don't want to talk badly. But he just kind of does it without it's like an incredible piece where he talks about everything without really thinking about his audience. It's like he needed to write that book. And that gave me a lot of courage, because I was being so worried, being someone who's online all the time. Oh no, what if someone is mad at me about this? Or what if I was really realizing that was my main problem in composing it, not even the symptoms, and how to write about it. Once I got rid of that kind of stuff, then it was like, yeah, the task of writing about stuff going in my body was actually quite simple
How
comparatively,
interesting. How
because
interesting.
I needed to believe that people would believe me, if that makes sense. I needed to give myself that permission, that even though in my real life, a lot of people were like telling me, shh, don't talk about this, like
Right.
that there was a world where people would hear you. And that was kind of the memoir world, and the illness memoir world.
And that's a really great message to hear. And I think part of, why do we have a journal of creative writing about health, illness, and healing? Because these are stories that I think often are stigmatized. People don't want to hear about your issues, right? They have enough of their own. But I think people do need to tell them, and I think people also need to read them, because they do find themselves in there. They may have been all alone, and they stumble across a poem or a memoir and say, "Oh, oh, I'm not the only one." So thank you. Rebekah, I'm going to ask you about writing about physical sensations. Was that a struggle? Was that easy? Are there things that you couldn't find language for?
I think it's funny when you initially asked the question, the first thing that popped into my head is that moment when the doctor asks you, like, at the beginning of your appointment, are you in any pain today? And you say yes. And, you give a number, and then there's like almost like a drop down list of words like radiating, pulsing, throbbing, aching, like all of the words. We have
Right,
these
that's
words.
me.
Yes, but yes, I mean, they're useful in that sense. And also there's sort of that limitation that you run into where some of these words almost become flattened in the way that they're used this way, the way that we report them. That readers, you say, I have throbbing pain, and it's almost like you said nothing, like it becomes meaningless. And so I think, yeah, like how do we navigate that? I think one thing in my writing is that I rely very heavily on metaphor. I think, Megan, I heard you mention metaphor also. So much so that my editors were like, okay, can we cut the metaphors in half, like half the number of metaphors? I rely really heavily on metaphors. I think also part of the making the embodied experience connect with an outside reader, I think there's a lot about my embodiment and physicality that I think is, as a baseline, kind of unrelatable to a lot of people. Most people don't have a body like I do or move through the world the way that I do. And I think one tool that I've used is to describe everything about my body in context. So it's almost like the difference between describing a raindrop versus describing that raindrop falling in the water and the rings that reverberate outside of it. So I think describing for physical pain, for example, has become a bigger part of my everyday life. And I think saying that I have throbbing pain that radiates down the back of my right leg is one thing, but to say that, like, to talk about the calculations I make around that pain, or the way that my day is shaped around that, or how I calculate when I'm going to take my next pain medicine to correlate with when I pick my son up from school, so that I will have this window of time when I'm actually cognitively present and engaged with him. Like the everything around that embodied experience, I think, translates to outside readers a little bit differently than just describing that radiating pain. But I feel like I'm working my way back to that initial question of, like, how do I actually write my body and not just describe everything around it or the ideas around it? So it's tricky. It's tricky.
It
Can I
makes me think
jump
of,
in?
yeah, sure,
Can
please
I
jump right
respond to
in.
something that,
Yeah.
because I think both of you were talking about this, and Danielle, it's something you said too, which is that the question of how the physician receives it, right? Danielle, you were talking about, like, oh, I get this word fatigue, and then I have to sort of prismatically think. And Rebekah, I love what you were talking about the radiating drops, because I do think that's the thing that's missing in our dialogues and discourses. I remember saying to a doctor friend of mine who was like, what do you wish doctors had done for you? Because my tests were a little bit ambiguous, but I was really sick. And then there was a period where they could tell I was sick, but they couldn't really do very much for me. And I said, what I was really struck by was the lack of a conversation about, like, what symptoms were impacting me the most, right? Or how did the symptoms impact me? Or was my fatigue different from other fatigue? Like, just this lack of a kind of, like, actually in a way, a sort of scientific parsing out of things, but a parsing out of how does this presentation, like, radiate into your life in a way that is pathological potentially, right? Or is impacting your life in ways that are related directly to the illness. And I always think that's this really interesting aspect of being a patient, is that you go in and you're thinking, my fatigue is the most distinctive thing about what's going on with me. And then you see a rheumatologist and they focus on the knee pain, right? Which of course makes sense. But so where is that dialogic space that's more about the nooks and crannies that you're not expecting to go to together? Yeah.
And I feel like there's quite a parallel in writing. As an editor at BLR, we receive, thousands and thousands of submissions, and people often will write about, a difficult experience they have, but it doesn't necessarily translate into really moving writing. And part of that is the specificity of the way we write, because you're right, if you just say I was tired, that's boring to read in a story or a poem. but describing the fatigue in a way, as you said, like sand, something coming down that makes us that's just a great read. And particularly when you're trying to write your own illness or describe it, to a medical world, that doesn't have necessarily anything outside those. I actually went to McGill University as an undergraduate, and one thing McGill is famous for is the McGill Pain Questionnaire, and there is that list of 5,000 adjectives. But you're right. I think when they first came up with it, it was revolutionary to have more than one word, or have many, many words for kinds of pain. But now it's checkbox, throbbing, needle-like, electric-like, and so it becomes this roteness, and it loses what would make a beautiful poem or fictional description of a character that's really singular, that stays with us. We lose that. I actually want to move a little bit to our specific books, and because I think each of you approach this challenge in a distinctive way. And so, Meghan, I'll start with you. And in the Invisible Kingdom, you discuss how our medical system and our culture at large, to be honest, are dismissive of untidy and unknowable narratives. So, I mean, your narrative was unknowable and pretty untidy. As a writer, how do you take untidy and knowable material and get that onto a page in a way that's got to be readable for an audience?
Yeah. Well, I think my narrative was much more knowable than my doctor's.
Right.
There were, like, when you look back at it, you're like, all I ever had run was your very basic, most basic blood work. No one really searched very hard in retrospect. And in fact, I'll just say my dermatologist, still my dermatologist, I love him. He was like, I feel really bad. He's like, I went and looked at all your tests. He was like, when you were 21 and you came in complaining all this, and he's like, you had a positive ANA that was weird and like high, but I just didn't tell you because I thought that's not what's going on for. Anyway, so how do you take, basically the entire project of my book was to think about how to, I think in all my work, I'm interested in how do we reanimate stories that often are pretty or very common in a way. My first book was about grief. This is about getting sick, which was not that common, but it was pretty common. And how do we move past our sort of hardened assumptions about what kind of story that's going to be, and what we might know about both the character and about the condition itself. So from the beginning, I knew that my book was both about my story, but it was also about how do we come to a place socially, culturally, that a young woman in the 21st century who came to her doctors reporting vague quote unquote vague symptoms such as fatigue and pain, and then some not vague symptoms like night sweats and other things, would be regarded as a kind of unreliable narrator. Why was it that I would go to doctors in search of care and kind of be met with a sort of incuriosity when I didn't believe that my doctors were themselves incurious or bad people? They were great. And so the book is both. So I thought, well, that's the thing that will give it shape, right? Is that you meet me as a character in the book who's confused. These things are happening to her. She doesn't feel well, but everyone's telling her she's fine. And so she doesn't know what the truth is. And in some ways, she's really losing her sense of reality. And then you also meet me as the narrator, the author, who's since done 7 years of research, gotten diagnoses, and is kind of coming in to contextualize, well, you have to look at the ways that modern medicine has moved toward evidence-based, knowledge for giving us all longer lives and better diagnoses, but also creating what one researcher I was just reading today calls the boomerang effect, where the more you have something that's unexplained, the more kind of unreliable you are. Then suddenly you're outside of knowledge, right? Whereas before, medicine might not have seen you that way. So the whole time I was trying to kind of braid a past self who was in an old kind of, she was on a quest to get better. And she didn't realize that the trajectory of this book was not going to be a tidy one of going from being sick to being well, right? That's a kind of story that Arthur Frank talks about in his wonderful book, The Wounded Storyteller, which I really recommend to anyone if you haven't read it, sort of about the kinds of illness narratives. He's a sociologist, the kinds of illness narratives we have. I was more stuck in this kind of chaos narrative that he talks about. But I wanted the book to come to, I'm a writer, so my job is to synthesize and metabolize things. So I wanted to come to some insights. So I realized at a certain point in the book that the book was about uncertainty. I announced this to my husband, and he was like, "Great, but you're still going to have to give the reader something." And so I thought, okay, the quest is she realizes she has to live with, she being me, this kind of body that's forever changed by illness. And she's not going to get better. But what she understands is more about what it is to inhabit a kind of mortal space, and also what more about our medical system and how it tends to interact with the body, right? And so I was really interested in just talked to about 100 patients. I talked to many doctors. I talked to many researchers, and just trying to synthesize all of that, not into something tidy that resolved and the illness was better, but into a kind of understanding of what conversations we need to have to all sit together in uncertainty in a productive way. Like, what does productive uncertainty look like, as opposed to denial or deflection on either side, right? And that's something I'm still extremely interested in. And the last thing I'll say there is I just was reading a book about diagnosis that's coming out really soon, called The Elusive Body, and you've read it, and it's just very interesting book about like how many diagnostic errors there still are, and how hard it is for doctors to talk about diagnostic errors, because it cuts very close to their sense of identity. And again, so thinking about the messiness, I was like, it's not just my messiness, it's like the system's messiness. And I wanted to really capture, how did we all end up here together? And yeah, divided.
And I love that idea of productive uncertainty.
Yeah.
Because, and it's one of the things when we train our medical students and nursing students, they come to us or through their training with the textbook, and here are the 6 criteria for rheumatoid arthritis, right? Check those boxes and you've got that. Here's the vasculitis criteria. But
Right.
again, patients don't come in with that. They come
Right.
in feeling lousy, and that's our
Right.
job to, and so we spend much more time in uncertainty than I
Yeah,
think people coming into it realize, and it's very unsettling. And I think it's
totally.
our profound discomfort with that makes it, okay, oh, you must be an unreliable narrator, you young female patient who
Right.
looks healthy with all these,
Right. Right.
kind of
Right.
nothing burgers symptoms,
Right.
because it does cut close to the bone for us. And I think that's
Yeah.
our own issues with uncertainty.
Yeah.
We had a question from our audience who asked about, what does it mean, or how does it feel to be a reporter who's reporting
Mhm.
on your own illness, but also reporting on the research and the larger issues at the same time?
I can quickly answer that too, and just say, I think it's very clear to me now that, when you're ill, your entire sense of self is disrupted, right? You can't do things you once could do, certain futures. I wanted to have children. I couldn't get pregnant. And in fact, when I was really sick, I couldn't write or think. So that was very challenging. But I would have these little windows of the day. I couldn't really read, actually. Like, I couldn't read novels or very long things. So I did 2 things. One, I wrote poems, and I would write like 1 line of a poem a day. And I could do these like little spurts of research. And I think that it gave me an enormous sense of control, right? It gave me something back, that I wasn't just passively sitting by and kind of waiting for someone to help me. I was doing some work to inform myself about my condition. Most of the writing of the book took place after I had been identified as having Lyme disease and babesia, which is another tick-borne illness, and treated for it. And I got inordinately better. I'm not like better in the old-fashioned sense of the word, a messy better. But I was then able to kind of do a lot of reporting and research. And I think it did 2 things. One, as a writer, I always like to think, okay, I have this intuition, but is my intuition correct? Or is it based on my experience? Am I an N of 1, or is my story, illuminating of a larger story? One of the things I know how to do as a writer is write about my experience. It's not something I planned to do with my life, but I just happen to be kind of good at it. But I want to make sure that that is then illustrative. So that's part of what the reporting, talking to other patients, was really helpful. And the thing I'll say too is it brought me into community with people like Porochistas and others, that really saved my life in many ways, was suddenly feeling like, okay, I'm not like this able-bodied community I was in before, but here's a community of my own, brilliant writers and thinkers who are also sick. or dealing with disabilities. And so the reporting really, really helped me feel like there was a way in which you can make legible an intellectual history that, again, kind of led us to a place no one wants to be in. And because it makes that legible, it gives me hope that we can kind of untangle that history too. And I think that's the hopeful piece of the book I wrote, is like understanding how we got here, understanding how our affection for measurement and certainty led us to this kind of place where it's hard to make diagnoses. And there's all sorts of other things going on, the busyness that doctors feel and the time pressures and all of that litigiousness. But okay, now that we know this and we can kind of stand in this space together, we can start to make something that was invisible visible.
Right. And I appreciate the recognition of the time pressure. And I imagine, the time pressure sucks for the physician, but it really sucks for the patient.
Yeah.
And how awful it must feel when you have this story that's complex, it's serpentine, and your doctor's under pressure because they're already running behind by 2 hours. How excruciatingly painful that is for the patient's story as well. Thank you for sharing that. Rebekah, I was going to ask you, in Sitting Pretty, you blend personal narrative with what I would call cultural critique. And so how did you, or how do you navigate writing about your own body while also trying to sort of challenge the societal narratives about your body and disability?
Well, yeah, I think that your question kind of tees up my answer well, in that I think that they um, have felt so deeply connected. I think I came to understand my own body inside of a culture, and that culture shaped my own perceptions. So I think as I have come out of, or like as I've gotten older and I'm able to sort of recognize that culture as a thing, that there's a gap between me and culture, that I can look at it and observe it and name it, as opposed to just swim in it and think that that's just the way that the world always was and could ever be. So as I've gotten a little bit older and had more space between myself and being able to comment on that culture, I think it was really just pulling at the threads um, of connection that had been built. So I think about, like, in the book, there's a lot of commentary on like representation and storytelling. So a lot of like film and TV, and thinking about the narratives that are housed in those containers. And it wasn't too difficult for me to think about the impact of that representation on my sense of self and my understanding of my place in the world. And so um, to look outward and to be able to say, um, I have a perspective on this that might be different than others, and to name that felt like a comfortable, and while it was a public conversation, it also felt like a personal one. It felt like bringing people into my childhood bedroom to look at all the magazines that were spread out on the bed. Like that's personal. It felt connected and present to me. So
Did you have a sense of whether kind of writing, you felt you had to write against this narratives of, societal assumptions about disabled bodies, that this feeling of having to be against it, or were you writing within it or around it?
yeah. I think it's interesting. I think that as someone who grew up visibly disabled, I think that it's not so uncommon, or at least it's been very common for me to be in this position of reaction, like perpetually, constantly reacting to people's assumptions, misconceptions, and so I think that is a comfortable and almost like default position that I have embodied, is to say, actually, that, like, you are actually not understanding my experience. You are actually assuming things about me. You're assuming things about the experience of disability, and to always be sort of like reacting or pulling the narrative really far in the opposite direction. And I think what I have found over time is that something is lost in always being in a position of reaction as well, like trying to pull the narrative. And I think that's maybe how sometimes for folks with disabilities, that sometimes we get really prone to like silver linings, or like the positive narrative or the overcomer narrative is like, I have to prove to you that my life is not just totally tragic. And so I'm going to yank the narrative so far in the opposite direction. And that can kind of become like a really developed muscle in storytelling. And so I think over time, what I've tried to do is, like notice the narratives that I feel like, like in the book, talking about the narratives, the cultural scripts that don't feel quite right to my experience, but how can I tell a story from a position of paying attention to what feels true right in front of me, that isn't just a knee-jerk reaction to try to correct the thing that looks wrong, but to actually tell a story that maybe has nuance or that embodies like a both and. That's harder to do, or at least it was a harder thing for me to develop. The reaction and the resistance felt like an easier instinct in storytelling.
Yeah, and I think for readers, it's also hard too. I think we're used to the poster child kind of narrative, um, and the March of Dimes type of thing, and so
Yeah,
it can be a little unsettling to have this narrative that could be a both and
yeah,
or completely, unsettle our assumptions, of what we're thinking. So
yeah.
that's really fascinating. Thank you so much, Porchista. Similar to Megan, you're writing about illnesses that are often misunderstood and dismissed a lot of times that themselves don't really have a clear narrative, for doctors and nurses. Um, and so I'm just thinking when you sort of approach uncertainty, even productive uncertainty, both like medically and narratively, do those inform each other at all?
I had a lot of trouble with how I wanted to structure this book, and I tend to be like a problem solver. So I was like, okay, but like I said, the final draft of it was during a traumatic brain injury. So this was like a real Rubik's Cube for me. And the structure was giving me the hardest time. So I kept doing new drafts around structure because I didn't know how to tell the story. I knew how to write an essay about it, but I didn't know how to write. And I'm someone who feels very comfortable in like a novel's format. I like lots of space, but I was really baffled. And then at some point I realized, oh, I could split it up in settings in my life, because part of the problem that some of us have with like Lyme disease is we don't know when we got that tick bite, like Megan talks about this so well. Like I never saw the bullseye rash. I never saw the tick bite. And then there's one doctor had a theory that I'd been infected multiple times. I had a CDC recognized case. Like it was, all my titers were unequivocal. Like everything was unequivocal. So it was kind of crazy that even with unequivocal Lyme, everybody was like, whoa, you have every co-infection, you have everything. I was still having trouble not being believed. And I started to realize there was just something about my presentation as like a femme woman with tattoos or something, that like wherever I would go, like people would just be like, oh, and they would always think I was really young, which now at the age of 48, I'm like, okay, that's great. But I was very pissed off when I was like 30 something, like I'm not 12, like please talk to me like an adult. And then if I got mad, then there would be like, it was so I sort of structured it along all these things. And then the big question with the structure was also like, to what degree do I want to talk about like addiction, and how does addiction fall into that? And I realized I was nervous about that because I was still in the midst of all this. That's the thing I often talk about, how in writing, we're always in the middle of the story, right? And I was like, oh, am I not going to get jobs now if I talk about the fact that I had a benzo addiction? Because a lot of people have memories of me doing really well when I was on benzos, which was not the case. Like I was enslaved to a drug schedule constantly. And I talk about that a lot in the book. And just like at a certain point, like my desk had more pill bottles on it than books. And my whole day was just regimented pills. But I had a severe dependence on benzos, and I couldn't find anyone in New York that took that seriously because it was so normalized in my world and even in my medical communities. So that was a nightmare for me. And so that was a big question of like how to integrate that into the narrative. And do I do it boldly like a Styron would, because I knew people would be upset about that too. And then how do I talk about relationships? Because relationships were happening during that time. And I had really rocky relationships with all sorts of partners that had their own issues, you know? And so how do you talk about like not great domestic situations? So these were all these layers that I had to like figure out, like, how would I tell my students to do this? Like how, you know, and I would do these crazy graphs and charts, you know, there's like a meme from It's Always Sunny, you know, like I was like that guy in the meme, like doing, like just losing my mind and not knowing how to tell the story. And then I had to just land on some structure. I still wish I could rewrite the book and add some things. Like after the book came out, I found out I had Ehlers-Danlos and other issues. And like there's a whole, like I was saying, the book tour period. So it feels incomplete to me still, but I had to just sort of have peace with it and move on. And the readers became a big part of the story too, because readers of the book would then write me emails and say, hey, like, I think you also have this. Have you looked into this? Have you talked? And sometimes their advice would be incredible. And so then later I created a Substack in 2019 that was for me just like trying to get back to words. Like Meghan said, it's very hard sometimes to think and write. So I just had this Substack where I was just, some of them, the passages in there are good, useful, maybe essay writing, but some of it's like just me writing like writers who are fashionable, cakes I made, you know, just like things to get me in the habit of it. So
Sure.
it's really hard. It's hard to write
I
when
was
you
struck by something you said though, and as a writer, you're always in the middle of the story. But I think in some ways, as that patients are always in the middle of their story.
definitely.
They're unless have a little bronchitis and then it's cured and the story's over. But for most things, I would say 80% of illnesses, people are always in the middle of the story. And I actually found that a really, as you said it, it just clicked in my head as what a useful way to think of it from the medical professional's perspective. That how that must feel like it's you can't close the chapter so neatly, and to like have some some grace for that. I did have one more actually question from our audience, reflecting like on the distinction between writing during the illness versus after the illness, or after an episode of illness. And someone asked, how do you write through brain fog? So I'm curious about the writing when you're sick versus writing when you're feeling better.
You're asking me?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. Oh yeah. So writing through brain fog, oh God, this was like a huge issue for me. So that's when I started developing some of the stuff that I talk to my students about, separating like the writer from the editor. I have a whole like course around this too, and just about how like we have to separate these modes and let the first drafts be dreamlike and messy and like garbage, and then separate that from the editor in you. And like that was like the only way I could do it. I had to like have these first drafts that were just completely like incomprehensible, and just to live with that and to know like 7 hours later I would return to that draft and my only responsibility was to edit that. And I wasn't going to do any other work. I was just going to clean up the house, you know? And then when that cycle became really pleasing to me, because I would go to bed feeling like I had a clean house. You know, like I said, I have OCD, so I need certain things to be like in order. So by separating those two modes, that was really for me a useful way to get around brain fog, because brain fog was a massive enemy to me. And the medications I would sometimes take with brain fog would then do all sorts of other things, like some of the ADHD drugs, for instance, they would try to put me on, would make my heart rate I'm very cardiosensitive. So then I would have panic attacks and I would be like, I don't want this medication because now I have panic attacks and I have to take something for that. You know, that loop you get into with one medication or another. So I just had to really focus on very grounding activities. And then I also had to let myself not write sometimes. I'm not a daily writer ever, but I would take breaks and be like, this is your period where you're just reading, or this is your period where you're just watching movies. This is your period, I would do as little work as possible. I give myself permission, because I've wanted to be a writer since I was 4. I've had a writing schedule for like 40 something years. So for me, it was a treat to let myself like say, hey, do your taxes today. Like that was like a relief to me.
Yeah, that's great advice, and everyone should get their taxes done.
Yeah.
I want to spot one more question to Megan, then we'll let her go rest, then we'll take some questions from the audience. But, illness in many ways disrupts a sense of self. And I think a lot of the healing process is about reconstructing or gathering that identity back in some way, maybe in a new place. And I'm wondering if writing in some ways helped you or was part of that process of reconstructing your identity, and did it reveal anything new about yourself?
Thank you. That's such a wonderful question. And I'm sorry to all that I have to jump off early. I still have a fever with my flu and I'm going to have to go get horizontal again. But just to tie back to my answer to this question about writing and sense of self, yes, I think, as I was mentioning, for me, the experience of getting seriously ill, which came with extreme brain fog and fatigue when I was most sick, meant a total estrangement from my sense of self because I couldn't write. There was no way to write with the amount of brain fog I had. As I said, I could write like one line of poetry a day, but I couldn't have written, I say this in The Invisible Kingdom, I could have written a paragraph of that book while I was really sick, but I would never have been able to write a chapter because I just couldn't do that kind of synthesizing work. And so I think the ability to come back to writing, having had an experience of losing kind of who I thought I was, what I thought I made me, which was my brain, my ability with language, having found it like hard to continue to teach because I was at one point teaching my students at Princeton and we were talking about a poem and I said, this poem is about, you know, the season that comes after winter when there are flowers on the trees. Like I couldn't think of words like spring, so I was always using these strange circumlocutions to talk. And to tie this back to something that Rebekah said that really resonated with me, which is that the sort of silver linings being imposed on you. One of the last chapter of my book is called The Wisdom Narrative. And in a way, it's one of the chapters that I wrote first, weirdly, and it kind of unlocked the book for me in this way that you're talking about, Danielle, which was it gave me the sense that I had lost a lot in being ill, but coming back to writing, there was something I could do now, which was to cast light on experiences that I never thought I'd have. And also that being ill really changed me. You know, I think it made me a much more like tolerant of other people's imperfections. I think like Porochista, I always wanted to be a writer. I was very driven. I was a perfectionist. I don't know if you were a perfectionist, Porochista, but you know, to suddenly be very humbled and you're have a total sense of your own vulnerability. And then to also watch how everyone around you is so uncomfortable with that having happened to you, especially when you're young, and wants to tell you, as someone did that I quote at the beginning of this chapter, but surely this illness has brought you something, right, that you didn't have before. And so that chapter and writing that chapter is like, yes, that's true. Like it has brought me insights that I didn't have before. But as I said to my friend in the chapter, but I wouldn't, it's not like I would have done this. Like if I had a choice, I would not go through it. I would happily have been ignorant, right? So the writing is this kind of double-edged thing where it's like, yes, it was wonderful to pick up writing again. And I wouldn't say not necessarily that the writing revealed something to me that I didn't know about myself, but that the illness did. And then the chance to sit with that and really process it on the page, as opposed to with the social cues of people around me who wanted me to perform my illness in a particular kind of way, right? Which is to say, it was so bad, but yes, I've come out stronger. Like, look now, I've written this beautiful book, right? So I think that that's where writing is really, really important. And I often encourage people I'm talking to or who are living with chronic illness to write a letter to their family, even if they're not writers, because my father read my book, even though we had talked about so much in it, and he was very sympathetic to me. When he read the book, he was like, I had no idea it was like that. Right. So I think sometimes when we slow down as writers and as readers or listeners, writing is a really powerful tool, not just for professional writers, but for anyone who's sick or anyone who's treating a sick person, to slow down and kind of get to a truth that can be harder to say interpersonally, especially when it cuts against the narratives we want to hear, the reassuring ones.
Well, that is beautiful advice. And of course, it makes us at Bellevue Literary Review feel very validated because we feel like that is part of this. We will say goodnight to Meghan, send her off for a nap and some hot tea, but we'll continue talking for a few more minutes. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, one of the things she touched upon, and I'll ask you, and Porochista, I'll just let you start, but then I'll go to Rebekah, it is about writing about vulnerability. How do you write about vulnerability without feeling overexposed?
Yeah, that's a question I'm thinking about a lot now as I like think about another memoir possibly, because it was terrifying actually. And I had everyone's nightmare scenario because I used to tell students the worst case scenario will never happen. But then all the worst case scenarios happened where my family hated this book so much. They didn't want to talk to me after the book came out. Then I had a bunch of stalkers. I was on like weird subreddits, like illness fakers and things like that. People started acting like I was a celebrity because this book got a lot more exposure. HarperCollins made a really big deal out of this book, and it just was like everywhere. And I wasn't even used to that. I had been in indie publishers before, big indies, but still small. You know, like Grove and Bloomsbury was very different than going to HarperCollins. So it was just like terrifying. Everything I dreaded happened, and it's been hard to even write since then. Because before that, I had had a still not always a easy reception as an Iranian American and Muslim writer, but it was like easier, weirdly enough. I was so shocked by how triggered people were over sometimes like a woman talking about issues around illness that also includes like a bunch of truly like when I was working on it, we weren't thinking about intersectionality, but that word is like so useful in how I think about my book. But it was, you know, I always sympathize with people who work on this stuff because I do think you have to be very brave and you have to believe in something larger. And for me, the idea of community has always been really helpful because even in spite of all this, I could feel a community, you know. I feel a kinship already with Rebekah, and I've never encountered Rebekah before, but like you can feel this like kinship when you talk about stuff like this. The right people do come to you. And so the vulnerability is rewarded on a higher plane actually than the day to day. And it, you know, there was even a few years where I would just talk to people like I don't want to talk about this memoir. I hate this memoir. I don't want to do events about it. I was so upset about it. And I realized it was like the trauma of some of the stuff that happened mostly after, but some of it was happening during too, because I would be posting about it and someone's reaction would be so like, Lyme disease is fake. Come on, shut the fuck. You know, they would just be like insulting me about Lyme disease. And I was like, no, because I know that when this person talks about it, you hear it. I know when this other, you know, and it was like warfare happening during it. So I don't know, come to realize like the US has a lot of problems with this conversation, but it's sort of the whole world does, it seems to me, because in Iranian culture, we have a lot of problems with this. So it's just like believing in a higher thing. And I realized I needed this book when I was sick. Okay, someone else is going to need this book. And it turned out that that part was definitely correct. And that we can handle, like I was able to handle like the worst of it. So that was, you know, but I don't want to sugarcoat it because just like illness, like we don't say like, oh, it's such a gift that I had the illness, you know. You
Right.
know,
I mean,
there
I think about
definitely,
my patients with serious illness, then they would not trade it. You know, I mean, they would trade
yes,
it off in a second.
exactly.
Something other than cancer. It's very very true. And so Rebekah, you know, a lot of what you write is very vulnerable. How do you protect yourself from feeling too overexposed?
My first response when you asked the question was to laugh, which is just like, I don't know. I think it's a huge thing I think about a lot. And it's a wonderful question. And I think we should all be thinking about that as people who, like anyone who's interested in sharing some of these personal kinds of experiences in our bodies. But I would say that I think my default position is an excruciating amount of vulnerability. And I think that I learned that really early. I mean, I think being a child who's not, I mean, there's the literal like not even blinking twice about just like lifting up my shirt and having the doctors examine my body, right? Like the privacy sense, you know, like learning really early, like, oh yeah, this isn't a big deal. But also the like, you know, just the utter ubiquity of like what happened to you and being expected to tell strangers your whole story of like your medical history to people you don't know. And so I think growing up with both that embodied experience of expected vulnerability or demanded vulnerability sort of created this maybe unhealthy, I don't know if that's the right word, but unhealthy comfortability with sharing really vulnerable things very quickly and kind of having that as a default posture. So I think for me, the longer that I do this and share writing, it has been about becoming a little bit more intentional about those edges and boundaries, especially now that I have my son and that he sometimes appears in my writing. It's creating a more of an awareness that not everything needs to be shared, that there are things that you can keep private. And so, but like Porochista, like you said, the the value of it, like the value of sharing those things is undeniable. And so you also have that embodied experience of knowing, like people who, like with my book in particular, the people that I've met, that when you see someone who felt seen by that, or understood by your writing, something that you wrote, I mean, like, you don't need very many hits of that before you're like, okay, I'm going to keep doing this. So I think it's a both and for me, it's really just a careful plodding along, and not hitting the publish or send button on any of my writing before I've really considered. I think one more thing I'll say about that, I have a picture on my desk right now that just reminded me of that. That I more recently have been going through my medical records, like old medical records from when I was younger. And one of the things I found in there were some photographs that were taken of me as a really young kid, in these medical settings. They serve some sort of medical purpose. And they're really vulnerable, kind of exposed, like vulnerable moments of me as this little kid. And thinking about protecting her and having an adult in the room to sort of create a boundary around that little person, and what it's like to try to be the adult in the room for myself now, to say these are the things that we can share, and these are the things we don't need to. And there's something valuable about holding that boundary for me, and I think also for other people trying to figure out where that line is. So all that to say, Danielle, it's a great question, and it feels messy for me.
Well, it is messy, and actually, it does touch upon what you mentioned about having a visible disability. In some ways, once you write the book, you've made your disability visible, whether it's invisible. So it is there, and it's the same thing I think that you've experienced your entire life. You can no longer hide this, and I obviously, and any writer writes about something vulnerable. People can trample on that, and they certainly have. And I think our social media culture makes it pretty easy for people to do that, sadly enough. But you're right, and I think Megan's point about the slowness of writing, but also the slowness of reading. That when people actually sit and read the book, take their time over weeks and turn pages slowly, it's very different than responding to a post online, which is like a reflexive thing. And I, one of our audience members, Emily, wrote, she said, I've been telling my own story as one data point and asking others to seek out stories of others who've experienced similar medical issues. So what do you think about this way of kind of framing the reliable storyteller problem, like creating these data points?
I'll just jump in because I was nodding vigorously.
Yeah.
That idea resonates with me a lot, and the way that I have thought about it myself is, it's almost like we're all on a map, like we're all sort of in our different positions on this great wide map. And to me, it feels like the story, like when we're able to narrate our stories and our experiences, it's like throwing up a flare on that map, and it's saying, this is what I noticed from where I am, this is where I noticed from where I am, what do you see from over there? And that, I think that there is a bit of mapping that we're able to do together collaboratively, and in a way that's both acknowledging the collaborative collectiveness of that storytelling, but also the distinctness and separateness, that there are ways that our stories are connected and overlap, and there are ways they're very distinct and separate from each other. And there's something, I think that idea that a data point, a flare on a map, really resonates with how I think about it as well.
Yeah, and unfortunately, so I'm going to ask you this next question. Janet wrote in, she said, in my experience with illness and now as a caregiver, I was astonished by people I considered close not showing up for me, and some I knew less well being incredibly kind. And I'm wondering if you had that similar kind of surprise, both in your illness and with your book, that you weren't expecting the reactions from people.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think we talk a lot in chronic illness and disability communities about how many friends you lose every time you have like a very big episode or a flare, or even with the book coming out, it's one of the most heartbreaking and weird counterintuitive parts of that. So I would lose friends, and then I would gain all these other friends. It was amazing. And that has been like kind of incredible. Like trusting strangers is a big theme in this book. Like you know, these weird connections I would make with someone in a waiting room. And they would be like life-saving for me because that person had no idea that I was like in a state of extreme suicidal ideation because my own community sometimes or my friends would let me down and I would feel so alone. I'd be swallowed up by that aloneness. I mean, it's kind of links to the other question you asked too, because like disability rights activists were probably the most inspiring people in my world. Um, I never met the late Alice Wong in person, but she was always messaging me and sending me encouraging messages, and I would write her back, and she would like try to find me scholarship funds when I couldn't afford something. Like Alice was in my life in a way that like some of my best friends weren't. There's another great activist, Carrie Higgins, if you guys know Karrie. Oh boy, Carrie's the first time I heard somebody in my world be really fucking angry online. I mean, later Alice would do that too, but I loved when Carrie was cursing everybody and she knew like when people were ableist, she would, I mean, she's just an incredible human being. I've never met her yet, but we just constantly talk online and these people were incredible models for me because I had such a tendency to want to like diminish myself. Oh yeah, Carly Finlay, of course. All these people like are huge and they were in my world and they would message me and I would message them. And so it was like this other universe. Because people also don't understand sometimes why we are so online. They would tell me like, get offline. It's like, I am in bed. I have been in bed for months now. I have to be bedridden right now. I don't have a choice. Like this is my only connection to the outside world. I am typing in my notes app, you know, like this is my little world right now. And someone from care.com hopefully is going to come and help me like pick up a bottle of water. You know, like there were times, like, a lot of this I lived alone, you know, so I'd be like crawling on the floor to get food, you know, things like that. And people in the outside world either didn't want to see that or they just couldn't accept it. And sometimes people would get very mad. I would have these weird things with loved ones where they would flip out at me and I'd be like, what the hell just happened here? And then they would apologize and they'd say like, I don't like seeing you like this. And it's like, I don't like living like this. Like, what is this? So you would see sometimes really surprisingly cruel sides to people and it was really hard. But I kept finding communities and that was really life-saving for me.
You know, it's
Definitely.
interesting when you see these cruel sides or difficult sides. I mean, I try to think about sometimes I have a patient who's really angry or nasty. I try to remember that person is suffering somewhere, and I imagine that people who have that reaction to, you know, one of your illnesses. It's triggering something in them that is really deeply unsettling. That
Yeah, I mean,
someone
I
young
always
and
called a
healthy could
difficult
become ill.
patient.
Yeah,
Yeah, like
I'm
you know,
sure.
when you label someone a difficult patient, that person's kind of screwed
Right.
always. You know, but they're like, now I have to be the difficult patient again. And
Right.
so that, yeah.
Right. Actually, Elizabeth put a comment here, one of our audience members. Should we define ill as that which totally matters but effing sucks and doesn't have to, right? And also comment she's having so much fun with you guys. So getting this, so as writers, we try to write the story. But as patients, we have to get that story to our medical professionals in a way that's meaningful. And for one of my books, I interviewed someone who was a chief listening officer at a hospital in the Netherlands. And one of the things she did was to meet with patients with complicated illnesses and help them shape their narrative into like a 3 to 5 minute thing that you could tell a doctor. Because if you walk in with a 300-minute, 65-page thing, it's just not going to work. So, how do you guys have any advice about shaping that narrative for yourself, but also for your medical team?
I have a quick thing. I mean, I always had to bring people with me and I would write out what I could, but we'd also rehearse because I got so traumatized by doctors at a certain point. So I had friends who I would like literally we'd prepare like an hour or half an hour before an important appointment because I was also often paying out of pocket for these doctors. And there were some doctors in New York that had the crazy rates, like $3,000 an hour. I still can't even believe my GoFundMe's paid for someone that was $3,000 an hour, but it was like I was desperate for this extreme, amazing expert. So I'd be like, okay, we have 1 hour with this doctor. It's gonna be 3,000. Let's go through everything. And then, yeah, that was great advice for me to take someone with me and unfortunately, sometimes it was even like just take a straight white man in a fancy suit. And I had those, even Cal Morgan, the editor I was talking to a few times, came with me and was like, I'm just going to be the straight white man in your world in a fancy suit. And they would listen to him in ways that they would never listen to me. So it was,
You know, it reminds me, we did a live storytelling event on the topic of body politic, and one of our storytellers told a wonderful story. Um, she's a little bit androgynous looking, and she came in with pain. And when she was wearing her hoodie and her baseball cap, people seemed to take her pain seriously. And if she would take them off, and her chest was visible, they wouldn't take her pain as seriously. So we would just kind of put the hat on, take it off, and just see how the medical teams reacted by, whether you presented more as a man or more as a woman. I thought that was really so.
Oh
Don't
yeah.
forget to take your baseball hat and hoodie when you show up in the ER. I don't know if Rebekah, you have any thoughts about how do you shape a story such that a doctor or nurse won't just write you off as the difficult patient?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, when you ask the question, I'm like, oh, this might be one of the weird benefits of being in the medical world for your entire life. Because
Yeah.
I wonder if there's an instinct. I mean, I think, um, it, I think I learned to be a really good patient really young, and I feel like I'm so annoyed saying that right now. It's actually kind of an annoying thing, but I think I just learned. Yeah, I think I'm even thinking about what you both were saying about being the difficult patient. I think for good and bad, I learned to be the most pleasant, the most chipper. Like, I'm going to make your day. Like, I learned that role, and I learned the language, and I learned the script so well. So I think, I don't know. I guess I do understand the value of them. And I think the idea of like having somebody listen to you and help you pull out the pieces is invaluable. I think that's really smart. But I guess I would just add like um what's the other angle of this? It's like there is a value in being able to translate that and communicate it to your doctor. But I think that I just also would say that if it feels like it's hard to do that, there is a tremendous value outside of that space of digging into all of the complexity and holding space for the complexity of it. Also, that was harder for me to do. So for what that's worth.
Yes, but I interviewed a patient with also a similar chronic difficult illness, and one thing she was telling me how she became so invested in the story of her doctors and nurses. She said, it mattered to me that these people got vacation and got a good night of sleep, and that they were healthy and happy in their lives, and sort of almost over identifying with their story. And I'm wondering if either of you, this is another question from the audience, ever noticed in the body language of your medical professionals any way they ever signal their empathy or their understanding of your story in the way they non-verbally responded to your story, or I guess the reverse, or didn't. But
Yeah.
I'm looking for something positive.
Well, I think, oh, sorry, Rebekah, go
No,
ahead.
you.
I was just saying that was a big thing for me because I've always had to be very like intense about my instincts. And so I would just do a lot of eye contact with people. I do that in general. And so, but sometimes I would be like, okay, what is this person responding badly? Like, can they tell I'm like an Iranian Muslim person? Are they racist? Are they xenophobic? Are they, what are they not liking? Is tattoo? Like, I would go into this zone, which was very neurotic and like not really about what was happening there. And so sometimes I'd learn to just verbalize it like, hey, I'm feeling like you're having a bad reaction to me. Is that accurate? And is it something that you, and that would sometimes just break the ice. Like someone just in the comments saying about even humor. If I could muster my humor, then things would go better. If I could break through the like typical stuff, then someone would like understand and then would be fine. Like at hospitals a few times, like hospitals can be so hard, right? To get anything across, and you have a million nurses, a million doctors coming in, it's chaos, you're not sleeping well, everything's just quick decisions about things. And so sometimes I'd be like, hey, give me 1 second? Can I just tell you, like, I'm feeling really weirdly ignored right now. And I don't know if it's like I've said something offensive. I would have to do those and they would be like, oh, and they break their script too. And then the nurse would tell me, like, I've been working crazy hours. My husband's like a nightmare. And I'd be like, oh, okay, great. Like we would bond on something like that would take us off script in our roles. And that would feel so precious to me. And it's become a way I connect with everyone all the time now, because it's like, oh, maybe we're all just responding to our own traumas instead of like these other things. Does that make sense?
That's really really fascinating. I know we're getting to the end of the hour and a half. For many people, who are not writers but are thinking about writing about their illness, and I think at BLR we see a lot of those folks. So we've started having some writing workshops on writing illness onto the page. And there's such an interest because I think that we don't have good ways of grappling with the challenges of illness. Even easy illnesses like, heart disease, cancer are complicated, right? Nothing comes right out of the box. And I'm wondering, for those who are currently living through an illness or have lived through it, and are considering writing, where should they start? And maybe Porochista, I'll start with you. Like, what do you recommend for people who are trying to write about their experience in some way?
I just tell people always to start with journaling, because that's kind of where I start. I do little I've noticed for other people, like I have very bad ADHD, so like Pomodoro method exercises and stuff sometimes can be a great way to bridge into journal writing. Because sometimes people are just overwhelmed, but like, how do you even do journal writing, creating little tiny bits of time, like 3 minutes here, 3 minutes there, if that's doable, or giving yourself more time to do it. I think the thing that we used to instruct a lot, like, hey, give yourself a writing weekend. Here's 48 hours. Like, that's a huge mess of time. You actually would procrastinate more and it would be hard, So restriction is very helpful for me, and I recommend it to others. And then just like a lot of reading, like, I don't know. I'm a reader before I'm a writer, and I think a lot of people are, but writers just feel like they have to constantly create, create, create. And sometimes reading someone else's work is so inspiring. Like, I literally cannot wait to read your work, Rebekah. Like, I have already bookmarked it, and I wish I'd already read it. Like that, I get so excited about reading. And so sometimes that gets you even more excited to write, because all of us, I think, here understand that this, like, we're part of a body of work. This is what I like about certain writers. Like, we're building on each other and together, and it's like all, and everybody in the comments I see is part of this community. And so it's not like, American capitalism teaches you like you are on your own and you must achieve, but if you think communally, it's a really beautiful feeling. That's what I love about being a writer. And I think you can feel that sometimes coming to things like this. I tell a lot of my sick friends, like, come to things like this. Like, I did a lot of those, and I sometimes couldn't even be on the camera. I was just like hunched over, and but it would still feel like I was part of something.
Do we have time for me to add on to that?
Danielle, we can't hear you. I think you're still
Oh,
muted.
Yes, we got plenty of time. Please add
okay.
on as
All
much
right.
as you want.
Yeah, just thinking about the how do you start? And I think in your question, and I might just be like projecting this onto the way you asked it, but I think I heard a little bit about like almost like a worry or like writing for how it will be received already, sort of like it's complicated, and how do I write this in a way that people will understand, or that people will not misconstrue it, or that people won't think I'm just writing about how hard it is, and like getting into that sort of like, I don't know, there's all that stigma around like self-indulgent navel gazing, especially when you come into illness. So I think part of what I'm thinking is allowing yourself to start from a place without any of that censorship, and I think maybe that goes back to that idea of journaling, of like just what is there, what do you have in you, what's in your gut that needs to be spilled out, like starting there. I think for me, I have had early in my life, and in my writing life, really locked down on, like I mentioned, like reacting to people and trying to make sure that my narrative resisted people's assumptions. So, like, there's nothing to pity here. There's nothing sad, right? Like, I'm really gonna just tell you the story I want you to hear versus what's really true. And I think what I found in my writing was that when it opened up and I allowed myself to write all of it, it was able to even out a little bit, and kind of something true kind of sifted up to the top. Um, the other thing I will say that is just feeling relevant to this idea of writing and narrative and bodies and illness and disability is that one thing that I struggle with sometimes is like a narrative getting stuck. And I found this exercise like shockingly invigorating and interesting to me, which was like doing blackout poetry with my old medical charts. So and I was just saw this like sitting on my desk. So I ended up like pulling out all of these medical charts, and blackout poems are like I don't know if anyone is like familiar with this form, but like you basically find you like start circling words that stand out to you on that page until you whittle it down into basically a poem. And then whatever, it's sort of like a poem reveals itself on the page. And so I found that as a really interesting sideways path into unlocking narrative. So like this one says, like everything is blocked out except visit the past, it might be useful. Or like on this one, this is a pathology report from like my early tumors, but I pulled out pathology findings, gross, fixed, labeled, the entire specimen is poorly seen. So I don't know if it was an interest, that was a really low stakes way into a narrative and seeing something in a different way that might be an easier starting place for some people. So yeah, there's a lot of ways in.
Yeah. And I would put plugs in for, as Portia said, reading. So there's some great books here, and you'll get an email with the follow up with the bookshop page for BLR, and you can pick up the books by Porochista, by Rebekah, and by Meghan. Reading journals. You become a subscriber and you support the literary ecosystem that allows people to write about it. And then there are also wonderful writing courses, and obviously we have one, but there's plenty of them out there. And I think having a chance to write in community can be very helpful. Everyone's taking their first baby steps and are putting all kinds of vulnerabilities onto the page. And not all of it is illness. There's many other vulnerabilities. But when people are kind of digging deep and pulling off those Band-Aids, they're excavating inside, and that's where the meat is. And it doesn't have to be, the final draft on that first page. And I think the idea of having some compassion, as I think both of you mentioned, of letting that first draft just be your own experience. And I know we think, oh, we're all complaining, right? We're complainers. To try and sort of put that aside. The first draft is where you can complain, bitch moan, you can say anything you want. And only later you'll go back, and that's where a writing community can be so helpful. So I just want to say a huge thanks to Meghan O'Rourke, who's hopefully sound asleep by now, Porochista Khakpour, and Rebekah Taussig for helping us, talk about this, and for all of this wonderful audience, for the hundreds of you who showed up. We really appreciate all your wonderful questions. We didn't get to all the questions, but thank you so much. Hopefully you've traded some emails, and we are just so excited to continue this conversations on creative writing and healthcare. Wishing you a wonderful night, and we'll see you at the next event.